When I first realized my parents had forgotten my wedding, I wasn't standing in a bridal shop or staring at an empty guest list. I was sitting on the floor of my apartment, surrounded by half-folded invitations, when my older brother's message appeared. "Mom says you need to call her immediately," followed by 3 missed calls from my father and a string of messages from relatives who suddenly seemed very concerned about my plans. I called back expecting an emergency, but my mother's first words were so casual that for several seconds I couldn't understand what she was saying. "Sweetheart, we've been thinking, and perhaps you should choose another weekend because your cousin Brielle's engagement celebration is happening that Saturday, and the family really needs to be together for her." I stared at the invitations scattered across the carpet, each one carrying the date my fiancé, Ethan, and I had chosen nearly a year earlier, and I reminded Mom that Brielle's celebration wasn't even a wedding but a lavish weekend party at a resort almost 4 hours away. My father took the phone from her and explained that Brielle's future in-laws were important people, that her event had already attracted hundreds of guests, and that everyone in the family had promised to attend, before my aunt casually added that Ethan and I could simply have a small ceremony another time because your relationship doesn't need a big production to be meaningful. For years, I had convinced myself that my family wasn't intentionally treating me differently, that I was simply more independent than my siblings, and therefore didn't need as much attention. But hearing them calmly discuss replacing my wedding date as though they were moving a dentist appointment finally forced me to confront something I had avoided since childhood. I asked one question: if I keep my date, will any of you come? And the silence on the other end answered before my mother finally whispered, "We hope you won't make us choose," which somehow hurt more than an outright refusal because they had already made their choice. I ended the call without arguing, then sat completely still until Ethan came home from work and found me surrounded by invitations, ribbons, and unopened family messages. And when he asked what happened, I told him everything without leaving out the humiliating parts. Instead of becoming angry, Ethan quietly pulled a chair beside me and said, "Then let's stop trying to build a wedding that impresses people who don't want to see us happy, and let's build something that belongs entirely to us." A sentence that made me realize I had been planning our wedding around the hope that my family would finally treat me as though I mattered. The next morning, I made a decision that surprised even me. I canceled the expensive ballroom we'd reserved, returned several deposits where possible, and called an old friend named Nora who managed a historic theater on the edge of a lakeside town, a place with weathered brick walls, enormous windows, velvet balconies, and an abandoned backstage garden that had once been used for summer performances. Nora listened to my strange request, laughed, and then said, "You have 1 week to turn this place into a wedding venue, and if you can pull it off, I'll give you the theater for almost nothing." And suddenly the disappointment of the previous day became a challenge I couldn't wait to accept. Ethan recruited his friends to help with construction, while I contacted local artists, musicians, florists, photographers, and small businesses I had worked with through my event planning career. And instead of spending money on luxury decorations, we created everything around the theater's existing character. Hanging gardens from old balconies, handmade lanterns along the aisles, handwritten vows projected onto the brick walls, and a circular stage beneath a canopy of white fabric where we would exchange rings. By the 3rd evening, the forgotten theater looked less like a wedding venue and more like a secret world, and I realized we had accidentally created something far more personal than the polished event my family had expected me to organize. Then Nora suggested something that changed everything. Because the theater already had broadcasting equipment from its days as a performance hall, why not live stream the ceremony for friends who couldn't travel? And after thinking about it for only a few seconds, I agreed. We created a simple invitation video showing the transformation of the theater, but we never mentioned my family, never hinted at the conflict, and never tried to make the wedding look bigger than it was. We simply wrote, 1 week, 1 forgotten theater, 2 people choosing each other. And within a day, the video began spreading far beyond our guest list. By the time my mother discovered the video, thousands of strangers had shared it, Local news pages were asking about the unusual wedding, and people from different countries were commenting that they wanted to watch the ceremony because the story reminded them of times when they had felt overlooked. My mother called immediately, demanding to know why I had turned a private family issue into a spectacle, and I calmly told her that I hadn't mentioned her once, adding, "You chose where you wanted to be, Mom, and I chose to stop waiting for permission to celebrate my own life." She became quiet, then asked whether there was still a seat for her, and although a younger version of me would have said yes instantly, I told her the guest list was already finalized, and that I wasn't going to rearrange everything at the last minute just because people were suddenly interested. My father sent a long apology that evening. My brother admitted he had never understood how often the family dismissed me, and even Brielle messaged to say she had watched the theater transformation and felt ashamed that her celebration had become the reason everyone expected me to disappear. But I decided that forgiveness could come later, because the wedding itself needed to remain about Ethan and me. On the morning of the ceremony, rain tapped softly against the theater windows while our small team rushed through final preparations. And for a moment I worried that everything had gone wrong because the flowers arrived late, one camera stopped working, and the electricity flickered just as guests began taking their seats. Then Ethan walked into the backstage room carrying 2 cups of tea, looked at the chaos around me, and said, "If the lights go out, we'll light candles. If the flowers are late, we'll use leaves. If the cameras fail, we'll remember everything ourselves." And suddenly none of the problems seemed important anymore. When the doors opened, I walked onto the old theater stage beneath hundreds of tiny lights, while the livestream counter climbed past 100,000 viewers. But instead of feeling like I was finally proving my worth to my family, I felt strangely peaceful because every person sitting in that room had chosen to be there for us. Ethan took my hands beneath the canopy. Our closest friends watched from the first few rows. Nora stood in the balcony wiping away tears. And when we exchanged our vows, I understood that the greatest victory wasn't having strangers watch our wedding or making my relatives regret their decision. It was realizing that I no longer needed their approval to believe my happiness was important. That night, after the final guests had gone and the theater had become quiet again, Ethan and I stood on the balcony overlooking the empty stage while messages continued appearing from people who had watched the ceremony, including one from my mother that simply read, "I finally understand what I failed to see." I didn't answer immediately because some wounds need time before they can become forgiveness. But I took Ethan's hand, looked at the little theater we had transformed together, and smiled because the people who once made me feel like an afterthought had unintentionally given me the courage to build a life where I would never again beg to be chosen. If there was one lesson I carried from that week, it was that sometimes rejection isn't the ending we fear it will be, but the door that forces us toward a life we were too afraid to create on our own. And while my family eventually became part of my life again on different terms, the old version of me, the woman constantly waiting for someone to declare her important, never returned. Please subscribe to our channel and share this video with your friends and family. We create entertaining and inspiring stories for our viewers, and your support helps us continue making great content for you.